Thank you, nice lady. All right, everybody. So, as far as the screenwriters laboratory goes, it's character month this month. And although I'm happy to go wherever the conversation leads us, I would love to hear everybody talk about what they think is the hardest part about composing a really compelling character. I mean, the kind of character that will live on beyond just your story, the kind of character that people will think about and be haunted by in a positive or negative way after they're done reading your script, the kind of character that people want to dress up as during Halloween, that kind of thing. That's ultimately what we're shooting for, right? We want big, bold, timeless, iconic, archetypal characters that really resonate and that people want to embrace. So, what's the big holdup? Why is it so hard to pull that off? On Wednesday and Friday, I'm hoping that I can share with you some stuff that will prove useful to you, specifically this thing that I've been cooking for the past year, that I'm pretty excited about. It's maybe something that I'll spin into a book at some point, but I'm going to give you kind of an exposure to the beta version of it on Wednesday, and then maybe a workshop. I'm working that out right now. Something more practical on the Friday, which I'm hoping would be really, really fun. But I really want to hear you folks talk about what you feel is the most difficult part of putting together a character that people want desperately to spend more time with. So why don't we start with Addison?
Ooh, the most difficult part in terms of just like writing them, like the actual writing process and the script.
Yeah.
I'd
If
say the hardest part to create like the best characters for me at least is making sure you're trying to talk in their voice. So like when
mm,
it's their dialogue, you're actually kind of writing as them and not as yourself.
Yeah, is the worst case scenario is that you're writing 20 versions of yourself and everybody sounds the same and kind of acts the same because they're all heavily informed by you and your sensibilities and your voice. Yeah, it's an important part of the whole mix that every single one of your characters is distinctly different from the others. So even characters that say grew up together, that spend all their time together, they need to be dramatically, specifically different from one another so that the characters don't kind of blur together. So have you kind of discovered anything that helps you in the process to make certain that at least the voice of your characters are very, very different? What do you do?
Um, like once you really kind of just narrow in on the characters, they kind of just speak for themselves a little bit. So like you almost picture them in your mind when you're writing it, and that just makes it easy. And then you go back and reread it, and just I usually say it out loud when I reread it to see if it does sound good or too much like another character, something like that. Just
Yeah.
kind of check myself.
So reading it aloud, so this is a dialogue specific kind of thing, even outside of characters specifically, like that's a great practice to kind of read your dialogue aloud, or if you're lucky enough to get other people to read it out loud for you, like in the form of a table read. That's
Mm-hmm.
really, really good. Um, yeah, because every character that we're writing has lived a life, right? Even if it's just a kid, they've lived their full life up until that point. So they've got tons of experience. They've got different experiences. They've got different preferences, different aesthetics. Everybody's got different fears, which is a really important part of engineering a great character is zeroing in on what they're afraid of, the kind of secrets that they're holding. All of those things inform the choices that they make and the actions they take. And you just cannot afford to have people sound the same. In my theater days, I used to work with a guy who was a really prolific playwright, but he would fall in love with his own dialogue. And if he had to kind of make a change to his scripts and cut out a character that said a line that he was really proud of, he'd just take it and assign it to another character. And if you can do that, then something's not right because nobody should be able to deliver the same kind of lines, generally speaking, as any other character. Otherwise, you're peddling in kind of generic comments from your characters. Okay, so great. Thank you, Addison. Let's hear from somebody else. What is the biggest hurdle that you've got when you're designing your characters and kind of fleshing them out, getting them out on their feet? Elise? Oh, I'll get to you next, Gary. Sorry, I didn't see your hand go up until I said the word the name Elise. Elise, what do you struggle with the most when you're kind of cooking your characters?
Do you know, I think the part that I found most difficult is this the misbehavior. You know, this definitive misbehavior that actually sort of is their problem and their superpower and that, comes through as their sort of saving grace somehow at the end as well. I find this concept quite difficult to sort of um manifest into the character.
It's a great one. It's a great one to struggle with because I love working with it, but it can certainly be frustrating. So Elise is referring to something called the definitive misbehavior, which is a term that I use, but most people would just refer to it as the character flaw, which I don't think gets specific enough. I like referring to it as the definitive misbehavior because um, it should be something that is explained from their past. Why are they the way they are when we first meet them? Why do they act that way? Why are they attracted to certain things? Why are they repelled by other things? What do they want? It's all informed in theory by some kind of traumatic event that took place in their past. And that traumatic event has created this kind of false identity that they're fully entrenched in when we first meet them. And everything they do in the early parts of the story is designed to kind of protect themselves. So that false identity is a cocoon that's designed specifically to prevent them from feeling that same kind of pain ever again. So it protects them, but it also stunts their growth and their ability to evolve and become their best self. And when they make the decision to get involved in the story after the inciting incident, and they come up with their first plan as they step into Act Two, that initial plan that they have of achieving their story goal is consciously or unconsciously, oftentimes unconsciously, designed to confirm their misbeliefs, like their misbeliefs. That's right, their broken belief system. So they're trying to
Yeah.
prove what they have wrong right through their actions. And it's not until about the halfway point that they start to really figure out that they've got it wrong. And then they get desperate. So yeah,
Mm.
the definitive misbehavior is a real cornerstone of a character outline when I'm working with people anyway. And it's super fun. The way that you get it is to go back and figure out what that traumatic event was.
Yeah.
Real people are made up of hundreds of traumatic events. Like we're informed by an entire constellation of pains that we have felt throughout our life. But when you're designing a character, it can be very, very useful to zero in on the one, again, root trauma that they went through and what exactly happened. Like Carrie, like some kind of horrible event took place in front of the entire school when they were a kid. Well, let's
Yeah.
figure out exactly what that was and what did they feel in that moment? Like what broke in them? And how does this new kind of version of themselves that they embrace after that try to protect them from feeling that way again? That's where I would go and keep drilling down. The more specific you can get about that root trauma event, the easier it is to kind of see what their definitive misbehavior is. And I'll be sharing, there's actually a few articles already peppered through the laboratory there that kind of cover bits and pieces of that might prove helpful. But that's what I would look at first anyway, as something that might help that. Does that help you out at all, Elise?
Oh, yes, I have actually been through all of your articles that you put through on character thus far. And there's so much excellent information in there. Maybe it's information overload, but it is just really that thing of I think because also I'm working, even though I've zeroed in on a main character in the ensemble, there is still an ensemble involved, in
Mhm.
the script I'm working on. So I'm quite clear on quite a few of those wounds, flaws or main problems for quite a few of the characters. But because the main characters I'm actually having difficulty with as to how to bring that out at the very beginning and not how that becomes a problem later, but how to sort of define it early on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really looking forward to
Yeah.
seeing how you respond to this emotional arc stuff because the whole philosophy behind the emotional arc is to set aside the plot based moments of your story and to focus exclusively, at least in part, like for a little while, on the emotional state of your character through the four major phases of a story. You know, so it's Act One, 2A, 2B, and 3. And there are very distinct kind of emotional states that a character goes through as they go through what we would refer to as the birth, death, rebirth kind of cycle that those four stages represent. Um, but most people are trying to figure out how to weave it into the external adventure for the character all the time. They're thinking about, okay, well, what has to happen? Where do they have to go? Who do they have to interact with? All that kind of stuff. But I'd love to see how people respond to just focusing on the internal journey that the character goes on. Is if you can capture that, and in my opinion, the ego death moment at the end of Act Two, if you can articulate that in a really authentic way, then you're on your way. And you'll have something then. Not that you can just kind of ignore everything else and just focus on the ego death. But if you don't get that right, then there won't be any satisfactory resolution to the story. Your character won't have earned the right to be transformed, and it won't seem genuine or authentic at all. So, um, yeah, so that's what this is all about, is trying to draw attention to just the evolving emotional state that your character's in, fully entrenched in this false identity for reasons of self-protection at the beginning, and then being broken down by the story until they're completely stripped of all that baggage. And then they can kind of rise out of the ashes of the ego death moment and see clearly for the first time and fully embrace what their potential is. Now, these are all kind of big, sweeping ideas that can sometimes be hard to translate into stories. But yeah, I'm really excited to see what everybody kind of thinks of the emotional arc template because it shouldn't bog you down with how does this fit into my external story. Most people start with the external plot like driven events of their story and then try to reverse engineer how their character evolves throughout it. And that's pretty difficult because I was taught from a very early stage in my career that the external adventure that the character goes on is merely a metaphor for the internal one. So it feels backwards. It's totally natural. Most people do it that they start with the plot and then they go to the arc. But that's kind of a backwards way of doing it. If you start with the arc and then kind of figure out what the perfect metaphor for that is in your plot, I think you'll find that the results might get a lot better. But I'm not saying it's an easy switch to make in your mind because it's kind of counterintuitive to a way that we've been taught most of the time. And all of this falls back onto another kind of philosophy that I have and I think is a good thing to keep in mind, which is that your protagonist is not a character that appears in the story. Your protagonist is the story. They're completely special, and everything is related back to them. Theme, everything. They are the lens through which all the other details of your story kind of have to be reflective of. So
Yeah.
thinking about them as just another character in the story, I think is going to get you into trouble as well. Start with where are they and what has to happen for them to kind of learn that lesson and shake off all that old unresolved baggage. That's kind of the question that I would recommend at least playing around with and seeing what might happen with. Anyway, I rambled on there too much. Thanks, Elise.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Gary, you had your hand up. What do you think? What's the biggest challenge in creating a compelling character?
For me, it's like wants and needs and getting those right. Like, I mean, like, I get to like I think of concept, but I get like the log line and then I stop and then go to the character and think, who is this person
Yep.
about? So I only do like that bit first and then but yeah, I it's like getting those right and getting them. It's interesting what you were saying about the wound, and that probably affects the want in some way or
100%.
need.
Both. It affects both.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the
So yeah,
want,
that's always I'm always like close to it, and then someone will say something that's like it's not that, and then I have to go back and sometimes I just want someone to tell me what it is based on what I've written.
Yeah,
It's like, tell me the answer.
that's totally normal. And
Yeah,
there's a dozen kind of attributes that I need to kind of clarify very specifically in a character before I can answer all of these things with any kind of clarity. So yeah, the want versus need bit is also created by the root trauma.
yeah,
So they've closed off and they've cauterized that wound and it's made them blind. They've got a blind spot as to what they actually need. They don't know what they need. All they know is a thing that they want, which is kind of more of a distraction. It's a surface level thing, you know? Like I want the money, I want the car, I want the job, I want the girl, whatever it might be, that kind of stuff. Whereas what they need is a genuine human connection with another person to feel good about themselves. But they don't want to admit that because that brings them closer to that wound again, which their false identity is trying to protect them from entirely. And it's all based on real human psychology too. Like our characters should feel like real people with, again, well-worn, lived-in lives. And you can pick up some details from the Enneagram. I don't know if everybody here has been exposed to the Enneagram stuff.
yeah,
The
yeah,
terminology changes, but it's basically 9 different archetypes of people. And it's a real world tool that psychologists and psychoanalysts use to ascertain people's state of mind and help them kind of become healthier people. So it's built on real human experiences and it's been used for decades and decades. So I recommend looking at that. And the better ones show you what each one of the archetypes is like when they're healthy and then when they're not healthy. And that's fascinating. Like, how do they turn when they're under a tremendous amount of pressure or they're getting kind of deranged for whatever the reason is? That's really, really cool to see that. That can help you sometimes identify strong wants and needs as well. Yeah, Jess, you've got a book on the Enneagram. Which one are you using?
Yeah, I was actually getting up to grab it off my bookshelf. I'll share it as soon as I grab it real quick.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's great. Again, there's dozens and dozens of tools out there, and there's other archetype like the categories of archetypes that you can base your characters on too. But I like the Enneagram because again, it's based on real world research and that kind of stuff, and it does kind of show you the good version and the evil version of everybody in those archetypes. There's 9, and I can't remember if I've posted something on the Enneagram in the lab in
I
Buzztown yet
think
or
you
not.
did. Yeah,
Okay,
I,
cool.
that's when I recognized the word and I thought, oh, I know what that is. And then, yeah,
So what's the title of that book, Jess? That's a big one.
Yeah, it's called The Road Back to You.
Oh, I recognize the title. Yeah.
And it was actually a book my therapist told me to get after she gave me my Enneagram test.
Yeah.
And it really does. It breaks down because each Enneagram is a number. And so once you take your test, you're given a wheel and you can see which number tested the strongest. And so you just look up that number in the book. And I mean, it described me to a T. Like it's insane. Like I quit following astrology because I just don't believe in it anymore now that I've gotten this book. And
Yeah.
and Jordan's right, like for each section, it gives you a healthy version of that, an average version of that, and a below average version. And then at the end, it gives you a checklist. So you can check off to make sure that you are, in fact, that number. And yeah, I love this book. I read it all the time.
Yeah, it's a good
Oh,
one. It's
very
a
good
really
book.
powerful tool. And if you can picture the different kind of states of mind or the emotional states that again that your character is in through those act one, 2A, 2B, 3, then you can ascertain that they may not be happy per se in Act One, but they're somewhat content, even if they know that there's more, even if there's this kind of gnawing feeling that there's more out there for them. They're relatively content and stuck in Act One. So you can go to maybe an average reading of that particular archetype. And then when you get into Act Two, then you can go to a below average. And by 2B, then they're really under pressure and the worst version of themselves is starting to emerge at that point. So it's fun to go in there and see exactly how that type of archetype might respond to being under that kind of pressure. And then, of course, when you're in Act 3, at least after the climax, then you can reinterpret them again and modify their behavior based on them being in a healthy state, having purged all that junk out through the events of the story. Yeah, but as Jess was alluding to there, be prepared because if you read through all 9, you're going to see yourself reflected in there too, and that can be eye-opening as well. So who knows? You may get some free therapy out of it. But that's a particularly powerful tool, and I recommend that to everybody. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I'd ever found another writer that referred to it, but everybody's talking about it now, and it's great. I think it's a really good tool for people to get familiar with.
Oh,
Okay.
yes.
Yes, Gary.
So in both in like the really good films, I guess, and like Back to the Future and Legally Blonde does it really well. Like Legally Blonde, she's like her want is to get Warner back, and then at the midpoint, she's in the bunny costume at the party, and then they kind of have a bit of an argument, and then she literally leaves the party saying, "I'll show you how valuable Elwoods can be." And then she's buying a computer in the shop, and she gets serious about her work. And so, is that kind of is it always at the midpoint that change, that kind of?
There's always variations, right? So I don't want to
Yeah,
talk about things in definitives or extremes like that, but also, yes, at the midpoint. So the 2A I refer to as the logical phase because they exit Act 1 with their initial plan in mind. Here's my goal, and here's how I'm going to achieve that goal. And it's all based on their own personal logic, not your logic, the writer. Their first plan, because there's 3 plans, right? There's the one at the end of Act 1, there's the one that happens at the midpoint, and then there's another one that happens at the beginning of Act 3. 3 plans are what it takes for them to resolve the story. So the first one is informed entirely by their broken personal logic, which is different from anybody else's. Any other character's logic should be different from your logic. So that's how they choose their goals and the method that they're going to use to get there. At the midpoint, they get rattled really hard. A bunch of things happen, but there's typically a false victory or a really crushing defeat that happens at the midpoint that opens their eyes as to how much trouble they're in, what the actual situation is. And they recognize at that point, for the first time, that there's no going back. Up until that point, they've been trying to reset their life to the way it was before, generally speaking. They don't want to change. They don't know that they have to change. They don't even understand they need to change. So they're just trying to put things back to the way it was before the inciting incident happened. But at the midpoint, it becomes perfectly clear that there is no going back. And that's when they go from the logical phase of 2A to the desperation phase of 2B. And they start vacillating back and forth between who they were and who they need to become. And the worst elements of themselves start to emerge. So it's at that point in every romance or rom-com that the 2 lovers separate and say, I never want to see you again, right? There's
yeah,
the vacillation and then the separation. And everything that goes on in Act 2B is designed to strip them so that they are, quote, naked and alone at the end of Act 2. So that when they have that ego death moment, when they come face to face with their root fear manifested, the worst thing that they can possibly imagine, something that they fear more than death itself, the very thing that that false identity that they were entrenched in at the beginning of the story is trying to protect them from, you make them come face to face with it at the end of Act 2. And that's when they actually experience the ego death moment, where that false identity is killed, destroyed, decimated. The verbiage for it in the emotional arc is really powerful. Like it's not just like they get a black eye. They get destroyed. And at that point, they can climb out of the ashes unencumbered by all that old junk and see kind of clearly for the first time. And that's when they can improvise the third plan. But they either come up with a new strategy for the first plan or a completely different plan at the midpoint. And it's all fueled by desperation now because they're freaked out about the idea that there's no going home. That what they wanted to get back to is gone forever. They don't want to change. They're still fighting it. So there's this other concept called emotional resistance, where they don't want to change. And they're going to fight tooth and nail until you put them through ego death, which is a really high level concept that's that's based again in real world psychology. And the emotional arc that I've kind of created is based on the work of a man called Stanislav Grof, who has been helping people heal from emotional traumas since the late 60s. I think he's retired now. I think his daughter maybe have taken over, but he wrote a bunch of books, and they're fascinating because it's all about him helping people through these really traumatic events in their lives. And he did it by getting them into higher states of consciousness. So they would basically be tripping balls, and then he would record their kind of experiences. And what was fascinating is that his is also broken down into four phases. So the hero's journey is basically four phases. The His stuff is four phases, and his is all mirrors perfectly the four phases of childbirth. It's really great. We don't have to get too bogged down with the details of exactly his stuff, but it applies in such a fascinating way to, again, birth, death, rebirth, which is, he calls it the basic perinatal matrices, the four phases. But I'm going to refer to it as Act 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. And the emotional state, the acts in the emotional arc are slightly different. Like the first and last are really, really short. It's from the opening image to the inciting incident, and then the inciting incident to the midpoint, and then the midpoint to the climax, and the climax until the final image. So the first and last are quite small. But at each stage, the emotional state of the character changes dramatically. And yeah, listening to the stories that these people tell when they're absolutely out of their minds. Initially, he did it with LSD. Now he's doing it with this kind of hyper breathing methodology that gets people sort of high. But when they're tripping balls, they tell these incredible archetypal epic stories. And when they get to the ego death moment, it's amazing. Like getting ground under the heel of the goddess Shiva, like just absolute total decimation of their reality and everything that they associate with their life. It's all utterly destroyed. And then they come out of it unencumbered. So if you can capture that kind of energy in your work, like and have the audience feel what your characters are feeling through those incredibly intense, painful moments, then you're going to have earned a really satisfying conclusion to your story. But that's why I'm excited by it, and that's why I'm excited to share it with you, just to see what you can do with it. Okay. Gary, did we give you a chance to air something out? Is that good?
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna look him up now, the psychiatrist.
Yeah, Stan Groff, it's not light reading, that's for sure. But I've condensed it, and I'll share a bunch of it with you through this week and make it. I've tried to make it into something a little more just digestible and applicable to story architecture. Hopefully, I've done that, and I'm happy to take whatever feedback you've got. But I'll walk you through the whole thing on Wednesday in much more detail.
Thanks.
Okay, who's up next? Eileen, what is the biggest obstacle, the most difficult thing that you find about writing a compelling character? Let's get more specific. Let's talk about protagonists specifically now, because you don't have a story unless you've got change, right? Unless you've got that transformation. So, what do you find the most challenging?
First of all, to me, the most important thing in any writing is the character, right? Because if you don't find something in that character that you're rooting for or rooting against or whatever it is, then you're bored or you're not going to watch it, right?
Yep.
And so I don't know. To me, that's the most fun. Like, it is the want versus need, and it's like I try to think of like and I was like going through my mind, like, do I have an ego death? And I thought, yeah, I have a really good ego death of this character who's the one whose husband dies, and she goes to Vegas they're tearing down the chapel, and they had to delay the funeral, and they're tearing down the chapel that she got married in. So her friends and her go to get some sort of souvenir that she can hang on to, right? And then some shit happens because it's action, but they have to go back to the chapel the next morning because they can't get in. So they go back the next morning after all this shit that happens, and it's destroyed. And she's destroyed with it, right? But she looks amongst the dirt and muck and finds something glittery, and she goes, and it's a gold candlestick holder. and she picks that up, and she carries that through the rest of the screenplay, and sometimes uses it as a weapon. And at the end with the funeral, she's got that candlestick in her hand, and that and to me, like the writing of a character, I have to use people that I know really well as my model, which kind of does the same thing as what you're talking about, but it's just people that I know, like, and their way they handle things, everybody handles things differently. So if you put the same, I need to get into that club, but I don't have a pass, three different people are going to find three different ways to get in there, right?
Yeah.
And that's the different characters, and that comes out in their voice and the way they talk to each other. Like one might be more cynical, one might be more like mama bear, happy and taking care of everybody, and that's how it works for me. So when I look at this, like this stuff you've been posting, I go back and make sure I hit those notes, or that's in there, right? Stuff
Yeah.
I've already.
Yeah. Like it's not about me telling you this is exactly how to do it and this is the only way to do it. But it's more, my hope is that it's, have you addressed this? Have you considered
Yeah,
this?
yeah.
Yeah. So if whatever you've got, as long as you've got something in there that addresses that particular dimension of the character and helps you kind of figure out what their motivations are, because you need to be able to communicate those things to the audience really, really clearly. If the
and
audience,
have that emotional arc for all the characters, not just the arc of the story, right?
yeah,
But then each character has to have their own arc, and they have to grow, change something
yeah.
in
We
that
should probably
journey.
mention that too, because there's methods out there of telling stories where the characters don't grow. Like there's basically two types of arcs. You'll hear people talk about a dozen variations, but for me, it comes down to two, and they're known as the evolutionary arc and the revolutionary arc. The evolutionary arc is the one that we're going to focus on most of the time because that's a character that changes throughout the stages of the story. The revolutionary arc is a character that remains steadfast and changes everyone around them.
Hmm.
Those are a lot harder to write, and they're not particularly popular, especially here in North America. So my hat's off to you if you want to try to take one of those on. But because then you've
That
got,
actually sounds really interesting, right? Changing everyone around you, kind of like a religious figure or something, or a
yeah, yeah, they've already got everything figured out, and they're kind of charging through the story, and the people around them kind of learn and evolve because of the exposure to that one character. It's more often that you use a supporting character in that kind of role, like an Obi-Wan Kenobi type, to help the evolution of Luke Skywalker, so to speak. But you can build entire stories around a revolutionary character too. They don't happen very often because they're real hard to pull off. But don't let me scare you off trying. But yeah, like you, the other thing that people sometimes have trouble with is that you've really got to put your character through a lot of pain. Like it can't be a nice, comfortable day. Nobody tunes in and reads those kinds of stories, and we can't really learn anything from people who are having a nice, comfortable day. So it's all about pain and how they manage that pain. And the want versus need is basically the want is a painkiller that's kind of keeping them numb to what they actually need. That's why they're so desperate to get it. They want this thing to make themselves feel better because they think they need it to to survive, to validate who they are. But in fact, something very, very different is what they actually need. So I think of the wants as like a drug, a fix, or something like that. That's again surface level. It's shallow stuff, and it's helping them stay ignorant of what they actually need. So, like, just to rewrite the kind of story that you were, and again, you just scratched the surface of what you were writing there. So, I don't want to suggest that what I'm about to say is the only way to tell a story, but having a character fixated on an artifact is great because in their mind, it represents the thing that they think they need. I need this thing. I can't live without this thing. And then throughout Act 2A, at least, they're in pursuit of it. And then at the midpoint, they're going to get rattled. Maybe they even have a false victory, like I was saying at the midpoint, and they get it, but they're not going to actually evolve until they lose it. So then 2B could be all about tearing it away from them. They had it in their hands and they think, I have what I need. I'm going to be happy now, blah, blah, blah. But then something happens at the three-quarter mark, like before the end of Act 2, where they lose it and it's gone forever. And it's that moment where they recognize they can't get the thing that they wanted anymore. And it's impossible. There's zero possibility of them ever getting it again. That's when things get really interesting in my mind. Now, what are you going to do? Right? They're destroyed. They're decimated. They've. It's like the moment where the kid holding onto the clump of balloons and the balloons slip out of their hand. That is a form of ego death. It was the most important thing in their world there for a second, and it's gone. So I'm interested in what is that kid feeling in that moment when they know the balloons are gone and they're never going to get them back. That's where the juiciest stuff is, I think, and that I love exploring. So anyway, that was just another way to kind of play it. But I love the fact that you've got this thing because it's representative of so much of their story and their history, and it's in an object, which is why in one of the articles I posted recently, um, I suggested that you kind of figure out what a prized object might be for each one of your characters, because you can communicate so much to the audience through those kinds of things. And the example that I gave was like an abusive ex-husband that kind of buys his way out of trouble because he's rich and he's got tons of money. So the object that he's kind of flashing around in front of people to intimidate them is a big fat money clip or a wallet that's just got tons of bills in it, right?
Yeah.
That's representative. That captures the essence of that character and what's important to
Yeah.
them. So anything like that can be really, really cool. And we love reading about what I refer to as culture, like character culture. What do they wear and why do they wear that? What do they eat and why do they eat that? I was always bored with people saying, tell me what your character ate in the morning, like tell me what their favorite color is, all that kind of stuff. I could never figure out exactly why I would give a crap about that kind of thing until I started to connect it with what I'm describing now as culture. Each character has a completely unique culture. And especially when you get into fantasy and science fiction in other worlds that we've never been to before, or if it's a corner of the world that we don't see and we've never been exposed to before, then their language is different. How they conduct themselves with other people within that culture is very different. And that's really, really fascinating stuff. So why do they wear their hair a certain way? Like it's not like you want to stop the story and focus on that and explain it. That's the opposite of what I'm talking about. Never explain anything. It should be self-explanatory. If you've done it effectively, the audience will figure out exactly what it is, and they'll enjoy putting two and two together instead of having you spoon feed them what it means. That's that's really important. I'm doing some feedback for a couple of clients right now, and there's way too much exposition, both internally and externally. Characters explain things to themselves, they explain things to other characters, they explain things to the audience. It's death. I want each of you to become so offended by naked exposition that you hunt it down and kill it in everything that you write. Never explain anything, and the audience will go. If you test it on people and they get confused, then fine, you can sprinkle a little bit more of an explanation back into it. But if you've got characters just standing there explaining things, then no, don't do that. You're actually pushing the audience to disengage because they don't have to figure anything out anymore. They're no longer involved in the story. You're just, again, spoon feeding them all the information that you think is most important. So avoid that. I derailed there, but that's a thing that I'm particularly hot about right now. Um, is if, in one script that I'm working on right now, if I were to cut out all of the naked exposition, it would get half as long. It's like that bad. It's pretty nasty. So you're hurting yourself when you do that. Anyway,
Can I just say something about that?
yeah.
I literally wrote this to Elise earlier today. When I'm writing like my shitty first draft, I over everything, like I over everything. I love subtext. I think subtext is amazing. I do all that like it's going to be like 200 pages. I'm kidding. I've never written 200 pages. Then I go back and for some reason getting it that shitty first draft, getting it out, I see it clearly and I realize I don't need any of that exposition. I can take all that out. I don't need to have she smiles, or whatever it is. Like I take it all out and then it's just that then I've got the story and the beats that I need to get, from beginning to end. Um, and it's comes through on the page because you can trust the audience, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And they don't put up with it. Like they get really bored quickly. So if they can't participate in the story, like Andrew Stanton from Pixar calls it the 2+2 method. right? You don't tell them 2 + 2 = 4. You just give them 2 and 2, and they
Right.
will figure it out.
Yeah.
There's a great analysis of No Country for Old Men out there about how they use that all the time, little bits and pieces that the audience kind of has to put together. I remember the moment after um, Anton Chigurh has confronted Llewellyn's wife in their home. They have a really serious talk, and it's a life or death situation. And then we just cut to him walking outside and standing on the front porch alone, and he cleans off the heel of his boot. So we don't need to see him kill her. We know that he's cleaning the blood off his boot. We know what happens.
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
way more interesting.
I love that stuff. No, I
Yeah.
think 100%. Yeah.
And if you kind of get into the culture of the character and their background and why they do these things, then you can make those moments even more potent because they're going to do something completely unique. Like his whole Shigur's relationship with his boots is hilarious. He takes them off and cleans them several times, and in a couple of scenes, he wants to protect them from the blood and the violence that he's obviously throwing around, casually throughout the entire script. Yeah, he takes them off and he walks in his sock feet at one point to be quiet. Like his relationship with his boots is a really interesting and integral part of that character. And it gets explored several different ways throughout the script in different scenes. That's what we need to do. Like, who are these people and what makes them special? And what do they love? Like, what is important to them? Not just philosophically, ideologically. Why do they love their boots? Why do they love their car? Why do they love this kid? Why do, all these kind of things. You need to be able to hint at it without telling the audience overtly why. Let them figure it out. It's a lot more
Yes.
satisfying that way. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool beans. Alrighty. Who haven't we heard from here? Jess, you're an old seasoned pro. What still kind of gives you a hiccup when you're engineering a protagonist, let's say? What's the biggest challenge for you?
I would say their arc and not showing it effectively, I guess. I think I do it, but I find it challenging. Like, and I guess that's where good feedback comes in. Is
Yeah.
just really showing it. So, like for instance, one of my characters battles with addiction and being able to show little things like once she hits a certain point of the story, you start to see her drinking water while she writes instead of drinking booze. And I feel like those are little things that you can do that shows the audience some kind of change.
It's great. Yeah, details like that are great. A change in routine. Act one, you setting up the routine of them in their stuck state. And then by act three, you can revisit some of those things or something similar and show how they've changed, how their routine has now changed, their preferences have changed, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it goes from drinking booze to drinking water. There's so much being communicated there. Those little tricks are great because the purpose of act one, and my favorite way that somebody ever described act one to me was that you're illustrating the character's potential for change. That's what Act One is up until the inciting incident. You're showcasing their potential for change. Obviously, that means that you're showcasing the fact that they're stuck and they're not changing. They're afraid of it or they're resistant to it or whatever it is. But if you do it in the right way, the audience can anticipate how they're going to change throughout the story and look forward to it. Again, they're going to be able to piece together what's going on. We know that they've got this tick, this definitive misbehavior that we're seeing illustrated in Act One. And then we're going to get the satisfaction of watching them behave differently in Act Three after they've gone through all this hell. Or if you're telling a tragedy, they're going to double down on it, and that behavior is going to get cranked up to 11 and it will destroy them. And that will be the tragedy of the story that they refuse to change and their brokenness consumes them eventually. And addiction is one of the most powerful kind of misbehaviors that you can kind of explore. I love stories like that. How did they become addicted and what exactly are they addicted to? Again, it's a painkiller in almost every case when it comes to addiction, like straight up addiction. What are they medicating about themselves and how did that pain first manifest? And the more that you can articulate it in very specific details, the more you can kind of engineer your act two as to how they go through being pushed, forced out of that comfort zone. Um, yeah, and it's not like 100% comfortable. They're not 100% comfortable, but they just are too afraid or unable to change. So the events of your story has to force them to change because they don't want to do it. None of us do. That's human nature. We want to be comfortable. We don't want to have to change and evolve. It's a tremendous amount of work, and there's always at least a little bit of pain involved. So we like being kind of static. We like routine, and we'll fight you. If anything significant changes in our life, we will resist it. And the bigger the bigger the pain, the bigger the change, the harder we'll fight it. And that's what Act Two is all about, is about that emotional resistance, which I'm using the work of a man named David Bayer, Bayer, to kind of talk about. He's another guy that's involved in therapy and personal development. And if we can capture these kinds of real human states in our characters and in our stories, then we'll have something more compelling because people will be able to recognize it as being real. It's authentic. This is what real people go through. It doesn't matter if you're telling a biopic or a fantasy and animated feature, these emotional kind of resonance that we're talking about right now is all that really matters. You can have a weak plot, but if the emotional transformation of your character is really, really authentic, then people will be on board and they'll support it. But you can't do it in the reverse unless you're Michael Bay. Inside joke. Yeah, he
Well,
doesn't go deep. But
have you
then
ever seen Tender Mercies?
a million years ago, but yeah, that's a great one.
See, I would disagree. I watched it again the other day because I was trying to follow his character arc, and you never actually see him drink. He's supposed to have a drinking problem, but he never drinks. The opening scene is he's arguing with a guy from inside his motel room, and all you see is their shadows, and you hear them arguing and fighting, not fist fighting, but like arguing and things getting slammed around or whatever. Um, but he doesn't drink the entire movie. You know, there's a place in Act 2A, I think it's 2A, towards the midpoint. Or no, it's right after the midpoint. So after the midpoint, I think he sees his daughter. Or he goes to try and see his daughter, and his wife won't let him see her. And he goes to the bar and he orders a water and just sits there, and he decides not to drink. Then he goes to a liquor store. He buys a bottle, but he pours it out. And then his daughter dies in Act 3, and he doesn't drink again. And so it just makes me think, like, he seemed like such, and he won best actor for it at the academies, and it won best screenplay, but I found it extremely flat. Like, I just didn't he didn't go you didn't see him with it, you didn't see a tragic flaw. You just knew he kind of had this past where it alludes to him drinking, but you never see it. And I don't feel like he ever arced. He kind of stayed the same, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd have to see that one again, but that some of that might have to do with like it being dated now and being of a slightly different style than they might tackle that material today. But the damage had already been done at the beginning of that story. That's 1983, by the way, for everybody that's not familiar with that one. That's Robert Duvall, and that's that role. So things have changed somewhat. That's not always the case, but some of those dramas um, don't translate to today terribly well. I haven't seen that one in a million years, so I don't know. But clearly, his alcoholism and the damage that it did to his relationships had already been established, like at the beginning of the story. And even what you just described to me, in my mind, illustrates his internal conflict. I'm going to drink water. No, I'm going to drink booze. No, I'm not going to drink the booze. Like just him fighting himself through that sequence of events there makes sense to me. So we're watching him struggle with it. And then if after the death of his daughter, he never does struggle with it again, then there is an arc there, but it's certainly subdued. So when I'm describing these kinds of things as a guide, they're kind of at full speed and full color, but you can play them more subtly or even more exaggerated depending on the type of story that you're telling. They're just kind of designed to be guideposts to help you along. And everybody's tastes are slightly different too. So part of the trick is also being authentic to your own personal voice and making sure that you really feel strongly about it and believe in the work that you're doing so that you can go to bat for it and talk to people about it. But not everybody's going to love it. So Tender Mercies may have won and cleaned up that year, but it wouldn't have been everybody's favorite movie even back then. So it's everybody's a little bit different. But what we want to try to do is to see through the story into these archetypal kind of states that people go through when they're working through traumas and growing and evolving, and try to see past the plot elements, because it's real easy for us to kind of stop at plot and relate with their arc in terms of plot and structure. But I'm hoping that I can create a tool that might help people focus on the other stuff. And then that's particularly exciting to me because then you each would be interpreting that in a very special way. And what does it mean to be in this emotional state? And your interpretation of that and how you would write that out and describe it on paper would be completely different from everybody else. So that's what I'm most excited about. But yeah, now you make me want to watch Tender Mercies again just to see what's up. He was great. I always used to be able to count on him. Lonesome Dove, that was one of his too, right? Like those are really nice, really, really good old classics. Anyway,
Lonesome Dove, probably one of my favorites of all
yeah,
time.
Duvall's awesome. I'm missing some of the character actors that I grew up with and leading actors that I grew up with. I'm getting old enough now that I'm watching them all die off, and it's bumming me out. So it's up to you folks to make the new movies that I'm falling in love with. Yeah. So what else were we talking about there? Painkillers, understanding the pain that they're going through and what they're doing to try to either hide it or medicate it can go a long way to you illustrating their potential for change at the beginning of the story. And then knowing that they're fighting, they're resisting it. That's kind of a trick too, right? Because we need them to be active, or you have passive hero syndrome, which is death. That's a cancer for any story. You can't have a character kind of get swept along by the events of the story. You need your protagonist to make choices and take action. And so have that written next to your workstation. They need to make choices and take action as regularly as possible. Sometimes it's in response to things. Sometimes they start it, but whatever. They have to make choices, take actions, and you want that all the time. Little moves within the scene, big moves within acts, and then obviously one major goal, their pursuit of passion, whatever it is you want to call the thing that they're in pursuit of from the end of Act 1 through to Act 3. But all of it's about choosing and acting. And if you can't get your character to do that regularly, then it might not be their story. That's another thing that I see pretty regularly too, is that characters kind of get pushed around by the story itself and they fall victim to the story that they are supposedly starring in, but they're not really actively involved and they're not driving the story. And without them getting themselves into trouble, there's no lesson to be learned. That's really important. They have to be responsible for the accelerating and escalating troubles that they get themselves into, even if they're responding to the actions of whatever the antagonistic forces are. They're making choices that continually put them in more and more and more danger, under more and more pressure, until they kind of walk themselves off the cliff and then go through that ego death moment at the end of Act 2. Some of that is denial. Some of that is just like a stubborn choice to prove their misconceptions correct. But they have to be driving the bus. Or that's not their story. In some cases, I can see that the antagonist is far more active and doing a lot more to drive the story forward. And the story would probably get a lot more interesting if you were to just swap perspectives and focus on that character. and make it a tragedy if you had to, you know. But don't let your protagonist become passive ever. Don't let them get rescued all the time. Don't let the other people solve the problems that they get themselves into all the time. They've got to continue to kind of do that for themselves. Okay. Who else haven't we heard of from? Ellie, you just got here lately. We were talking about everybody's major kind of obstacles when they're building a protagonist. What do you find most challenging about creating a protagonist that people really resonate with, they like and want to spend time with, whether or not the character's likable or just fascinating? Again, characters don't have to be likable, they just have to be relatable. What's the biggest hurdle for you in creating a great character?
For me, the biggest problem is um, giving the character a backstory, giving them a past. And it's not just with the protagonist actually. It's with all characters. For some reason, I don't know, I'm it's something that presents a major obstacle to me. Fleshing out the character's past.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Like you may have missed it at the beginning of this. I was saying that all the characters in your story have lived a whole life. They got tons of experience, and they've all got really different preferences and sensibilities. They've got a different way of talking. You know, like where did they go to school? Did they go to a public school? Did they go to a special school? How much training have they got? Are they articulate? Are they upper class? Are they lower class? Like all of these questions, there's 100 of them out there. So I encourage you, if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, to go out there and get these character profile questions, and it'll just try to help you envision where they came from, what kind of experiences they've had in their life. And that might help you kind of fill in the blanks as to where they came from. I'm working with somebody right now that is writing, I think, a pretty solid story, but the characters are kind of running flat at the moment because we haven't really drilled down on what I called earlier culture, each character's culture, and what makes them really, really special and unique. And I loved this. I think it was in a bio. I'm not even sure that it was mentioned in the script, but when the writer was describing a character to me, and it was a supporting character, they said, "Oh yeah, he's a retired RV salesman. He used to sell like trailers and RVs." And I was like, "Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so what are you doing with that?" And it doesn't appear anywhere in the story. So I was like, "Well, why doesn't he wear an old, worn out kind of Utah RV world kind of, shirt or something like that?" And he gets into an argument with another character. And I said, "Well, why don't you say the one character says to the other, okay, Liam, whatever it is, if I want to buy an Airstream, then I'll ask for your opinion, but right now I don't want to hear about it." That kind of thing. Why use that culture to inform how they interact with one another? Everybody's story has got just a rich mine of details and color and caricature. And a lot of people, I have this metaphor when I say I see people who seem to think that they've only got that little 8 crayon box that you get at the dollar store, and they don't recognize that they've got the big 64 crayon box. There's way more colors in their own story, using their stuff, not injecting anything from the outside, just with the concept that you've already got. Your central ideas, your basic characters are all way richer than sometimes you recognize. And I find myself most effective in helping people write better stories when I just teach them how to ask questions, giving them more questions to ask that they answer because they've got all the answers they need already. They just don't have the questions yet. That's more often than not the case. Obviously, this is about skill building, and that takes, repetition. It takes kind of practice, yada, yada, yada. But a lot of the time, it's just about asking the right questions and about showcasing every one of the characters that you have and every detail in your story like it's a superstar. No dead wood. Everything's awesome. Every character is the kind of character that an actor would just fight to play. That type of thing. You have to do them justice. And I would bet money that everybody's story that you're working on right now has got more than enough rich possibility built into it already that you can have super fun with these kind of moments, these character moments. And that little exchange that I just described to you is so illustrative of each character's attitude and history with one another as well. That's the kind of thing that I think zeroing in on what I describe as culture can do for you when you're writing. It's fun. I love it. Elliot, have you got anything else you want to chime in with?
Um, no, I was just gonna say, um, I've tried the question thing. Like, I've found a list of questions, uh, addressing the about the character, uh, um, and but maybe I need to double down. I think maybe I've been afraid of just producing bad quality material. And that's kind of held me back, stifled my creativity.
Sure. That makes
And
perfect sense too. I'm sure a lot of people are afraid of making mistakes, and that kind of stunts their ability to write really colorfully. I would recommend you, especially at this stage, it may feel like the stakes are high for us right now, but the stakes are not high. Nobody is screaming at you to deliver a screenplay at the moment, right? There's no money on the line, there's no contracts on the line, there's no due dates or anything like that.
that's true.
So it's just something that you're working on. It's a labor of love for you. And I encourage everybody to swing hard and to just layer as much detail in there as possible. Especially during the first draft, when you're just kind of the vomit draft, what I call the mud draft. Get everything, every idea you want out there and on the page. The worst case scenario is that you have to edit it back down. But if it's fat because you've put in all these extra details that you may not have otherwise, first of all, it's a lot more fun because you're having fun kind of filling in all these different colors, different character moments, different character details, all that kind of stuff. But the second is that if, like me, your first draft is 170 pages long and you've got to cut out, 60 pages, then you get to choose the best of. Of all those ideas that you put on the paper, the next draft is going to be your best of stuff. And it will be easy to see what needs to be cut out and what's not, what should stay in there because it's all going to be about, the story itself and the reader's ability to comprehend exactly what you're doing. So it'll be comprehension first, but load it up. It's not a big deal to have to edit it back down again. Again, nobody's waiting, right? So have fun with it and really flex your muscles and just layer in as much color and character and atmosphere and tone as you can possibly articulate on the page. Who cares if it's 200 pages long? Then you go back and you refocus on just the actual spine of the story and pick out the bits and pieces that you love that really twinkle, that really crackle or sparkle. Everybody's got their own word for it, that seem to have a lot more potential in them, and keep that stuff and cut everything else out. But if you write thin, then the danger is that when you go to your second draft, you're going to need to flesh things out because maybe you wrote short, maybe you don't have quite enough material. And that's when you get into the injection thing. There's another one of the big things that I love to say is that the best story ideas are always extracted and never injected. So if you're now throwing random things in from the sidelines just to fill out Act Two, then you're in a bad way. That's probably never going to work. You want really strong ideas from the very beginning and then just pack that first draft with everything in the kitchen sink. And I think it's a better idea to distill from there than to try to inflate from something that was too skinny to begin with. And it's a lot more fun, in my opinion, anyway. But don't get freaked out about expectations or what anybody else thinks about your work at this stage. It's irrelevant. This is all about you getting comfortable with your voice and your process and really kind of settling into what your specialty is going to be. And in order to do that, you've got to experiment. You've got to push the boundaries out. You've got to make tons of mistakes. You've got to overdo it. And I'd much rather overdo it than underdo it. In racing, they say it's a lot easier to get a driver to slow down than to speed up. And that's what I would suggest for each one of you too. Because if they're afraid of going too fast, then they're never going to win a race. But if they're afraid of losing, then you're okay. That's all right. That's something you can work with. That makes sense? I'm
Um,
getting,
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
go for it. You've got nothing to lose. So go for it and just again, write the most Ellie story you can possibly write. Whatever
Yeah,
it is you're most interested in, whatever you is that feels most important to you, pack it with as much of that stuff as you possibly can.
yeah, I take your point. What's worse that can happen? You might get berated, you might get
Berated
uh
from who? Who's going to berate you from expressing yourself? That's craziness. The only conversation that's going to happen, in my opinion, is that they'll say this wasn't effective, right? What was your intention? Well, this scene doesn't work because da da da. So what you have on paper isn't effective yet. And then you polish and distill from there and you get until it does, right? I'm a big proponent in jettison words like good or bad. They're no use to you and they're objective or subjective, I should say. Sorry. Good and bad are useless words. It doesn't matter if your writing is good or bad. Different people will have different opinions on whether or not what you've written is good or bad. All that matters is whether or not it's effective. And that conversation takes you back to, well, what is it? What are you trying to achieve? What did you want your audience to feel? Those kinds of things. And then you can just simply say, is it effective at doing that or not? Is my horror story effective at making people afraid or loathing or creeping them out? Is my comedy effective at making people laugh and having a good time? That's it. Forget about good or bad. So people berating you, what are they berating you at for? Like that doesn't make any sense. And if they are, then they're not useful feedback partners.
yeah, maybe they maybe I've been need to get away from these people.
Yeah, I would say so. Everybody here in this room wouldn't do that to you. There's no point. There's no point in doing that. There's no value in it. I would have to hear a person like that explain to me what they think they're trying to accomplish. But berating a writer is useless. But explaining to them why you think maybe these choices are not effective and here's a choice that may be more effective, that sounds productive. But it's not about beating you up for trying. That's ridiculous. That's another version of there's no such thing as competitive arts. That it doesn't exist. Our job is to move people on an emotional level, which is why I'm so excited about the emotional arc. I think it's potentially a really powerful tool for helping people do that. But part of it is also coming into our own. What am I about? What do I stand for as a writer? What's my voice? What makes me special? So that's all looking inward and flexing these muscles that we've got. And you're going to eat some dirt. That's all there is to it. You're going to write some stuff that's not effective. You're going to write stuff that people don't like. That's part of the business. It's inevitable. And the only way you should come away from those kinds of experiences feeling those that you've lost something is if you don't learn from them. And like we were talking about, if you're emotionally resistant and you don't want to change or evolve and change your style and you just keep writing things that are not effective, well, that's on you. But if people give you critical, constructive feedback and you can use it and learn from it and evolve and change and get better at what you do, then that's a win. It's always a win. All creation is iteration. I don't know where that quote's from, but that's a big one too. You're not going to make it in one move. You're not going to make it in one script. It's going to take a while. It's going to take years. And it's the same for everybody. Don't feel like a loser just because it's going to take you like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years, whatever it is, to really write a killer script that you're super proud of that you can sell. It's just part of the process. So enjoy the journey because the destination is not the most important thing. What is the destination? To sell one? No, you want to do this regularly. You want to continue to do this. So the journey is the only important thing. And it's about manifesting your best self as a writer that can move audiences. Anyway, I went on a real tear there. I feel like I'm at the altar, the pulpit, I should say. Yeah, but anyway, thank you for sharing, Ellie. And yeah, don't worry about that kind of thing. I'm sure you're on the right path. Who haven't we heard from yet? Cindy, do you want to chime in? What are you thinking? What's your experience?
Well, I probably have the least experience of anybody here on the screen, but a little bit. So everything that's been said has been so helpful as always. But there's one thing when I was writing that was really um big challenge in that trying to find that line between what an actor interprets and portrays versus what the intention is of the script that's trying to convey through the character. It's a very, it's a kind of a nuance. It was for me to say, okay, how do you take the inside, put it out on the paper, and then you also bring in what an actor is going to do, as well as a director. I mean, or is that even an issue? Maybe it's a non, maybe I'm just overthinking this. But I think to be really effective, you have to know how to do that. And when you start from zero, like I did, it's a big challenge, you know.
Well, you're pretty unique in that you've also got the hat of a producer on. Like you want to walk through your project right to production.
Mhm.
Cindy's telling a real life story and she wants to see it through to the end. So Cindy's not going to be somebody that's happy with just selling her script and then watching somebody else take control of it and reinterpreting it.
Mhm.
So yeah, as far as a generic writer's experience, you're probably crossing a line that most of us will never have to address or worry about, or shouldn't, because we're going to be muscling in on, like you say, the director or producer's territory. Because that's another bitter pill to swallow is that most scripts are going to get rewritten. It's very unusual that they don't, unless you stick with it right to the end, like Cindy's dedicated to doing, and I know is going to pull off. Um, but in most cases, if you just option or sell your script, it's going to go into the hands of another person, or it's going to come back to you and they're going to say, we want these changes made. So you're going to have to rewrite your own work, or you're going to have to watch somebody else rewrite your work. So that's
That
not
would
necessarily
that would
something you need to worry about.
well, and the producers that are interested are interested in the script, I said, well, what do what do you want to, change, do anything? No, they loved it. They just loved it just the way it is. I said, great. And they said, we don't want to interfere with anything. You want to be part of this thing. Okay, great. Well, then we're back to the financial issue. Well, what are you bringing to the table here? So at least I can launch from something, but then there's big, you know, so I guess that's where my question came from is just, um,
Well, I
you know,
think,
I mean, I have a little maybe different experience, so, but all of this is so helpful. I mean, I just, my only thing is I wish I had started this like, a long time ago. This is so much fun. I
yeah,
just enjoy it so much.
I can relate to that. I get involved in film pretty late in my life. But um, yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about as far as how to attract, well, these are my words. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how do you attract an actor and what do you give an actor that gets them really excited? So again, over explaining, naked exposition, both internally and externally within the script, like explaining what things are and why they are important and that kind of stuff is a negative. So you're not letting the reader kind of interpret things and get excited by their own interpretations. It's ultimately going to come down to the director. And in your case, I'm sure you're going to be communicating with the director. Again, your situation is kind of a unicorn.
Mhm.
So it's not going to be the kind of relationship that most writers have with a production, but it's about, I think, capturing that internal conflict that any character worth its salt is always struggling with. Even the best villains are not two-dimensional, machines of evil. They're the heroes of their own story. They've got a lot of conflict going on as well. They feel very justified in what they're doing, and they're just annoyed that this hero character is in their way and doesn't understand their interpretation of right and wrong. And if you can capture that kind of conflict and nuance in a character without over explaining it, then actors tend to respond to that really well. And they find that really interesting. And if you're lucky, you've got an actor that'll ask questions and want to know your interpretation or the director's interpretation, whomever it might be. Then you can get into some really cool conversations. And I got to experience that in theater a lot of the time, which was just wonderful. Why? What's going on here? Um, anyway, I'm not going to walk through that scenario, but I appreciate where you're coming from, and I'm super excited about you speaking with producers because I know a little bit about how cool that project is. So
Well, a little bit. Thank, thank you, Jordan, for everything.
I
I mean,
worked I worked with Cindy on that particular project for 6 months, and it's
well,
really
it's
great.
not.
Yeah.
Well, thank, huh. Well, and that was the example of, okay, we have this much, now we need to bring it down to this much, and then you can't just stand up there and do this on the screen. So, oh,
Yeah.
okay. So now I'm in working through the book, it's just, I guess I'm having the relief of being able to just do all the explanation that I like, but the screenwriting process was so helpful too, to be able to do this part. So,
Great.
you know, so I'm again, I sit with gratitude every time I'm with you guys, and appreciate your skill, and so many things to think about that don't really come to mind. Some of it comes naturally when you're developing a character or where you're talking about a character, but the biggest challenge is taking these more quiet characters and putting them visually, because the big personalities are so much simpler in a way to write down. But the quiet that quiet stream is a little more difficult. But then, there are movies that are nothing but one person, and their entire process,
Yep.
shipwrecked and all these other things. So, but they're also kind of a little boring.
Well, you'd
So
hope not. You'd hope not. But like, um, what was the Tom Hanks one? He's shipwrecked.
yeah, when the
Castaway.
ball
Castaway. Thank you. Yeah.
cast
Or
away.
the Robert Redford All Is Lost. Yeah. Just one actor performances. And again, that's not something that's really uncommon in theater too. So I've seen those before. So capturing that kind of nuance in a way that you can carry an audience for an hour and a half to 2 hours is tricky for sure, but it's there. And in my experience, the most productive conversations happen very early on in the process. And I remember fondly our conversations about, what is this? What are we going to do with it? And making big choices early on how to contain it and from what perspective to tell it, and what our goals were throughout it. And then we kind of put a few options out on the table, and I obviously you chose the ones that resonated with you the most strongly. And after that, it was just a matter of distilling these things, but never losing track of the big choices you made at the very beginning. What is it? What do we want the audience to feel? How do we want the audience to be moved by it? Those kinds of things. And every other choice after that is in service of those big choices early on. And it was just a really lovely process. So I thank you for working with me on that as well.
Well, oh my gosh, Jordan, I'm the one that thanks you. I'll give you just briefly, because I think this might be helpful to everybody. Um, in the writing and the feedback I've gotten from different folks that have read the screenplay, and they all have very different. I mean, there's a common reaction, and then there's, I guess you would call, subtext reaction to those that have a more personal connection to the story, which has been quite profound. And that really tells me, hit the mark. So I think it's just stay true to your voice and what you feel innately, what's going to resonate. And I'll never forget, Jordan, your direction as to how every scene has got to have a purpose. If it doesn't move the story forward, if it doesn't move your character, there's no fluff in there. And of course, you don't have time for fluff, but it really is. I mean, I can look at the 40 scene, format that we chose to do that, and every scene is very deliberate, but there's a reason for the scene too, with respect to the bigger reason for the whole story. So that's another, I think, thing to keep in mind. And I really hope to write at least another one screenplay at some point. In all the things that I've learned, that was one thing that sort of cohesively held everything together. It was just that deliberate intention of every scene and why. So Then you fit that into your other arcs and everything else you said.
There's a few moving pieces, yeah, when you're
Yeah.
writing a feature-length story or a novel for that matter, whatever it might be. Yeah. There's a
Mhm.
billion choices to make, and some people can get exhausted by them. So that's why I really appreciated what Brooks did for me was introduce me to process. And I've gone bananas with it. I've taken his process and I've kind of put it on steroids, and now I've got something that I'm really happy with because I tend to overthink everything for the benefit of whomever I'm working with, I hope. But process was the big difference for me because that makes it manageable. You can just bite off manageable chunks of the story and expand on it, starting with the central conceit and then just building it out and building it out, and then checking back with your original choices that you made to make sure that everything you're adding to it is organic, natural. Again, it's an extraction, not an injection kind of process. And by the time you get out to that outline of 40 beats, like you were describing there, it's pretty well distilled. Like it works pretty well. Um, you've still got a million miles to go because now you've got to get into scene building and that kind of thing, which is a whole other world. And you've got to get into pagecraft, which is yet another world. But the foundation and the bones of the story have been proven, right? They've been broken and rebuilt and broken and rebuilt. So you know that you've got a pretty strong structure at that point. But jumping into a first draft from just a loose idea is a nightmarish proposition in my mind. And it doesn't really work for too many people. So I really love the idea of just nice, manageable processes and then just moving the story down the track. And if you hit a bump and you can't figure it out and it doesn't feel right, you roll back to the previous stage, go through the process again, and then roll forward. It's no big deal. Again, nobody's screaming at you to get it done.
Well,
So just
that's the value of that treat. Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's the value of that treatment that you made me do that I wasn't happy with. But I'm happy that we did it in the end because that's exactly what is needed. I mean, to really break it down. And in fact, at the end of the day, the treatment was changed to uh make it flow for whatever reason. So, but that was a huge step. And because you kind of, at least I kind of wanted to get started as a right dialogue, right? But no, you really have to think through the whole thing. So that's just my ignorance, but I'm learning.
Yeah,
Or-
that's nothing unusual about your excitement to get rolling. Everybody wants to jump into scene writing because that's where the fun is. Right?
yeah.
Dialogue, character moments, all that fun stuff. But if you don't have a really strong foundation built at that point, then you're just going to write yourself off into the darkness, and you're probably going to create a nebulous blob that doesn't quite work. So
Mhm.
that early developmental stage and concept development is really important. And it's not necessarily everybody's most exciting thing, but that's become my specialty because we've had such good success with spending so much time on that stuff. And I love it. So
A huge difference because then you really are ready to roll, and it doesn't get tiring that at least okay, this scene is next and this scene is next. I mean, for me, it's like, ooh, yay, now I get to do the next one, but that was me. But it was very valuable.
yeah.
That was very valuable.
Well, great. Well, thanks for sharing. And again, I'm super excited and I definitely want to hear more about what's going on because I'm quite confident that yours is going to hit a screen at some point. And I'm going to be there. I
To
will be.
be yes, you oh my goodness, but to be continued. There's lots to fill in, but not now.
Okay. Sounds great. So did we hear from everybody? Because I think we're an hour and a half in, I think, except for you, Peggy. Do you want to chime in and just give us a couple of nuggets of insight on?
You can hear me, right? I'm not on mute anymore.
No, hear you pretty good. It's a little teeny, but we can hear you. What do you struggle with the most when it comes to building your, let's say, your central character, your protagonist?
Well, echoing back to Eileen talking about writing down cord so I can get you on my phone. Okay, that's probably better, right?
Yes.
So I would say I overdo everything in order to get to build it down. I think that's the most I, like misbehaviors are where I live. So like every moment that I have an opportunity to see anything in life that has an inherent misbehavior, I try and study it because it's so organic that it's not made up. Like everyone to me is an opportunity. Um, and so um, I would also say that like for me in several other screenplays that I'm working on, that I would find my main character, find their misbehavior, and then I would find the physical things. Like I have a screenplay called Lucky Duck, and the kid is obsessed with CB radios and then transistor radios. So then I went out and I bought all these vintage transistor radios and all these really cool Japanese transistor boat radio. Like I just bury myself in the artifacts of what it is so that I can work through that. I don't know if that's a negative thing or not, but it makes for a full house. Um, and then I would say that uh, so yeah, for getting your ear accustomed to things that are legitimately the way a character would behave. It takes me a while because I may not believe that it's quite right yet. So I had a guy that I who was like the Venezuelan Olympic team horse trainer, and I went to his farm for a long time, and he was so charismatic and amazing, and loved by everybody. And this year he got angry at his son and decided to shoot at his son, but he shot the horse instead. And it's been really interesting to hear. I'm like, that's the kind of like genuine like arc of story of somebody who's like goes from, he trained the Venezuelan Olympic team and rode in his own Olympics in the 80s with his brother. Like to see that actually happen and then know that you understand that energy because you spent all this time with that person. He wasn't killing anybody then, but anyway, and then to listen, and then we were back in North Carolina and listened to everyone then talking about him on the other side was super informative because they had their own ideas. Anyway, it was great from just a study point of view. Um, and then what was the other thing? I've been trying to track based on what everybody else said. Um, I think that's it. And I know we're also out of time. Um, I took in um, all those misbehaviors and I have to work them artfully into my story because I can go off on a tear. But there's clues all around. Like you can just look around and see people. I think I've. Oh, and then the other thing I was going to say is like it's very collaborative, right? The fact that my process makes me want to physically hold props. I mean, it's just because I work in the business, so I end up knowing, about the prop department. But Frances McDormand in Three Billboards, the studio had a heart attack because they wanted to dress her in a unisuit through the whole movie and give her that freaky haircut. And of course, Martin McDonagh doesn't take notes from any studio and is protected by his producer. But everyone was rumbling about the choices he was making to define that character. And it is so great. It's so great to watch all those normal studio people get completely fucked up about like, oh my God, she's going to wear a unisuit. How are we going to do this? How do you make your main character look that way through the whole movie? Anyway, so it's great to see how it plays out, obviously also with department heads who, the costume designer who dares to make a suggestion. And I have to read the script again to see if he actually talks about how she's supposed to look because it's been a while now and I haven't read it in a while. So anyway, that's pretty much it.
It's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing. What a wonderful project. I love Three Billboards. And yeah, as soon as she walks on screen,
I can't hear anything. Hold on.
as soon as
My
McDormand,
phone. Oh, there we go. Okay, now I didn't hear anything. What did you say?
you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say it's cool. And I would be curious too, because I've got that script, but I can't remember if she's described looking the way that she did on screen. But nevertheless, when that character walks on screen, you get a really good idea of who you're looking at, even before she
Mhm.
starts saying anything, right? The way she carries herself, the way she looks is really, really important. And whether or not it's in that script, it can be in each one of our scripts. You can all use those same tricks to communicate these things to the audience without spoon feeding them. It's all subtextual. It's all deep with meaning, though, because all how she looks, how she presents herself, how she speaks has got everything to do with the traumas that she just went through when the story opens up. And
Mhm.
that's
Yeah, and I think yeah, all that invisibility, all that like all that subtlety is great when it's like contrived subtlety because then you're I mean obviously the audience like Jess was talking about Tender Mercies um, and him struggling see I would go for the invisible stuff because that's my nature right I would hate the nail on the nose nail on the head or something say that just I can't stand that stuff when I see it I'm like oh, why did you do that I didn't like that was you didn't need to do that but some people don't get the subtleties right so you have to find that
Yeah. Yeah.
that that gives the audience enough line that you don't that you want it to be super invisible. Um, and but that to me is that assumption of the ability for you to deeply and first free movie.
You're breaking up, Peggy. We can't hear you anymore. Can you hear me?
Okay, that's probably good. It's probably good you can't hear me anymore. Anyway, we're out of LA. There's no more traffic. Thanks for such a great session.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay, well, that's a great way to put a button on it, as we say, on the scene. So, yeah, thanks to everybody that showed up today. I appreciate hearing you talk about what you do because that's what we're here to do, is to celebrate what you do and to help you do it as best you possibly can. And to be, what's the word? Effective. Yay. I'm going to drill that into everybody's head eventually. In fact, I'm going to get my own Writer Igniter shirts with the word effective on the back of it. Try to send that message home. But anyway, if you have the time and you are so kind as to be able to join us again on Wednesday, then I'll have a more of a deep dive into the mechanical working of the emotional arc and kind of a target for the emotional state that your character's in through the four phases. I'm excited to kind of share that with everybody. And then on Friday, the idea is that I'll have something practical for you to do. So you get to kind of roll up your sleeves and play with it, break it, kick it around, see what it does. Because I would like to evolve it further. And if you can help me make it better and more powerful for more people, then I'd be greatly appreciative of that too. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of the day. And I hope to see you all on Wednesday.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye.